Switzerland is almost more famous internationally for its watches than for its cheese. All over the world, people agree that Swiss watches are particularly high quality. It is not for nothing that the saying "punctual as Swiss clockwork" exists. For this, some people are willing to spend veritable sums of money. In 2014, the super complication watch from the Swiss company Patek Philippe was auctioned off for a whopping 20 million euros. In fact, the small country with its population of around 8 million is the undisputed world leader in the sale of watches. And not just any watches, but those from the highest price segment, so-called luxury watches whose prices start at several $1,000s and which are sometimes even bought as investments. Although Switzerland produces only about 2.5% of the world's watches, it accounts for more than 50% of global sales in the watch industry. In terms of value, the country is the largest watch exporting country in the world. The Swiss watch industry is, after the pharmaceutical and the machine industry, economically the third strongest export sector of the country, with almost 60,000 employees. In 2020 alone, Switzerland exported watches worth 21.7 billion Swiss francs. Wristwatches in particular are clear bestsellers. Over 90% of watches sold are mechanical or electronic wristwatches. Top Swiss watch brands include Rolex, Omega, Cartier, Longines, Patek Philippe, AP, Tissot, Tag Heuer, IWC, and Richard Mille. These 10 companies alone accounted for 67.3% of the global luxury watch market in 2019. One-third of this was generated by Rolex alone, arguably the world's best-known watch brand. But Switzerland has not always been so strong in the industrial field of watches. In the 14th century, when mechanical timekeeping replaced the sundials, hourglasses, water clocks, and hour candles that had been used until then, no one had any idea that the Swiss Confederation would one day become the watchmaking location par excellence. Instead, it was mainly Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Holland that fought for the pioneering position in watchmaking. On the one hand, they were already considered luxury goods for the aristocracy at that time, and on the other hand, demand in these countries was particularly high due to seafaring. With the help of the precise time, the sailors could orient themselves much more accurately. Therefore, the nations worked at full speed to perfect their clock movements. While clocks were initially rather inaccurate and, above all, large, the so-called spring drive developed in the 15th century made it possible for mechanical clock movements to become ever smaller and more precise. The German master locksmith Peter Henlein finally produced the first portable watch in 1479, a forerunner of the later pocket watch that was to be fashionable throughout Europe for almost 400 years. Until the 19th century, it was still necessary to wind it regularly with a small key, otherwise it would eventually stop ticking. This problem was finally solved by a Swiss man called Abraham Louis Perellet. How did it come about that Switzerland had outstripped all of Europe in just a few centuries? As so often in the country's history, it owes this success to an important refugee movement that laid the foundation for the watch industry, the Huguenots. In the second half of the 16th century, the French Calvinists were persecuted by the regime of King Francis I of France and fled en masse to Switzerland. First and foremost, the Reformed theologian John Calvin himself. He had already fled to Geneva in 1536 and immediately began to reform the local church structure. He criticized the accumulation of possessions of the Roman Catholic Church, and he himself strictly rejected any display of ostentation or wealth. In his opinion, a good Christian should live as modestly as possible. The ecclesiastical ban on wearing jewelry greatly affected the local economy. Many Genevans have previously worked as goldsmiths and now had no way to sell their jewelry. A few decades later, thousands of Huguenots had followed Calvin's example and fled France. Many of them settled in Geneva and on the surrounding hills of the Jura Arc. Already in France, some of them had devoted themselves to watchmaking, which was a prosperous craft in France. The Geneva goldsmiths seized their opportunity immediately. They could no longer sell jewelry, but watches were officially utilitarian things, not showpieces. They joined forces with the Huguenots, learned and worked with them. And their concept was successful. People literally clamored for the elegant watches. In just a few decades, they managed to turn watches into small works of art that were popular as far away as the Orient. From then on, the watch was not only a useful device for measuring time, but also a status symbol. For a few centuries, the Swiss watch industry was unstoppable. The entire Jura chain became a center of watchmaking. Sometimes whole families worked in the industry. Even today, 90% of watch production is located in this region, which has adopted the motto Watch Valley, the land of precision. Their zeal for work and perfectionism led to regular innovations. In 1770, the Swiss inventor Louis Abraham Perellet managed to develop the first watch movement that no longer had to be laboriously wound with a key. It became known as the shock watch because the vibrations of walking caused it to wind itself. Although it was not yet an automatic watch, the invention was groundbreaking for the Swiss watch industry. The pocket watches were not replaced by the now popular wristwatch until the 19th century. The first known wristwatch was made in 1812 by the Swiss watchmaker Abraham Louis Breguet on behalf of the Queen of Naples, Caroline Bonaparte Murat. However, it did not arrive in society until about 100 years later when airline pilots noticed how practical it was to have a watch that always left your hands free to steer. It was this innovative edge that ultimately made the Swiss watch industry so competitive internationally. It almost had to give up its watch monopoly to the industrialized USA. In the second half of the 19th century, American manufacturers were already mass-producing watches, much more cheaply than Swiss watchmakers and flooding the world market. As a result, Swiss watchmakers' exports plummeted by a full 75% in just 10 years, plunging the entire local industry into crisis. To revive domestic production, inventiveness was needed. At the beginning of the 20th century, Swiss watchmakers introduced all kinds of innovations to the market. First, there were watches with calendar or stopwatch function, or the first waterproof watch from Rolex. But the big breakthrough came with the first automatic wristwatch, which was manufactured in 1926 in the west of Switzerland. From then on, the Swiss were once again the undisputed leaders in watchmaking. Rolex, Omega, and Cartier in particular built a cultural image and became a symbol of luxury. Even James Bond is regularly seen wearing a Rolex in his movies. Not even the Great Quartz Crisis that shook the global watch industry in the 1970s could harm Switzerland in the long run. When inexpensive electric watches from Japan flooded the market, it hit traditional manufacturers hard. In the US and Germany, almost the entire watch industry disappeared. Swiss manufacturers stuck to their high-quality standards despite price dumping and were rewarded. While the competition had to file for bankruptcy, things in Switzerland went steeply upwards. Today, Switzerland is so closely linked to the image of the watch industry that the label Swiss-made already inspires confidence and quality. The luxury watch industry is an important pillar of the Swiss economy, and there is no end in sight to its success.